Okay, so today I'm going to do a short talk on the subject of film tropes in Wallace and Gromit. Obviously the first question we need to answer is, what is a film trope? Okay. Does anyone know what a film trope is? No? No? No. Well, a film trope is something that you see not just in one film, but in many different films. It's something that is repeated, something that is common in many different films. Films often copy each other, sometimes because they think the other thing is a good idea, sometimes because they want to make fun of another film, and so they copy something which they see in this. And film tropes can take different forms. For example, it might be just the type of film which is similar. Okay, so for example, these films, has anyone seen any of these films?
Yeah.
Yes, like Bad Boys and Lethal Weapon and Stakeout. These are examples of what we call sometimes called buddy cop movies. These are movies normally when there are two policemen who are very different. One's very conservative, one's wild, and this is a very typical film trope. You see this commonly in many different films. It might not be just the type of film, it might be characters. So, moving on to my next thing, you might see certain characters who are similar in many different films, and they sort of copy each other. So, for example, this idea of sort of the evil bad man in films, you see in things like James Bond, some cartoons you see it in. These two are from James Bond. I think this is from a sort of a comedy film which makes fun of these types of movies. This is a very familiar film trope, the idea of sort of the evil villain or the evil genius. It may not be characters. Another type of film trope is situations or things that happen in films as well. So for example, this kind of situation where two men or three or four men are pointing guns at each other, which is called a Mexican standoff. This is a very typical thing you'll see in a lot of action and thriller movies. And again, this is what we would consider a film trope, the idea of sort of men pointing guns at each other. And in the cartoon that I'm going to talk about, Wallace and Gromit, it's a cartoon and it's set in Britain, but it tries to copy some of these film tropes, situations, characters, types of films. And so I'm just going to talk about the way that it does this in the films of Wallace and Gromit. The first film trope I want to discuss is something called a Heath Robinson machine. Does anyone know what this is? Has anyone heard of this expression? No? A Heath Robinson machine is something which takes a long time to do something very simple. It's a machine which is very complicated, and it takes a lot of operations to do something very basic. In the films of Wallace and Gromit, there is a scene at the beginning where one of the characters wants to make toast. But he has this very complicated machine which does lots of different things before it makes the toast. There's lots of things going up and down and round the kitchen, and finally the toast gets made on the plate. And this is something you'll commonly see in movies, and I think this film is trying to copy this idea. There was a very famous cartoon in the 70s in Britain called Thunderbirds, which had this very complicated beginning to the film, where the characters would go into their rockets, but they wouldn't just walk into the rockets. They would go up a sort of an elevator, and then their chair would go back, and then they would go underground, and finally they would go into their rockets. And I think it's copying some of these. Or if you're familiar with James Bond, has anyone ever seen any James Bond films? Yeah. Yes. For example, when the bad man, the villain, tries to kill James Bond, he never just shoots him. He always has a very complicated way of trying to kill him. Normally involving sharks or something where he's slowly going down into the sharks, and of course he always escapes. So this idea of a very sort of complicated sequence to do something very simple is a very common film trope. The next trope I wanted to look at is the idea of a crazy inventor. A very common side to a character in films is the idea of sort of the scientist who's a little bit crazy, a little bit mad, who creates machines that sometimes go wrong or are sometimes used for bad purposes. In the cartoon Wallace and Gromit, the main character, whose name is Wallace, creates these very complex machines which do a variety of day-to-day tasks. And he's often considered to be a little bit sort of crazy, a little bit forgetful, like many of these crazy scientists in films. Does anyone know this film? Yes? Frankenstein? Yes. This is sort of the first example, really, of the mad scientist or the crazy inventor. And you'll see these a lot in many different films. You know, a fairly more modern example is this. Does anyone know this film?
Yeah.
Which one is it?
Back to the Future.
Exactly. In Back to the Future, the character of Doc Brown is a very typical sort of crazy inventor with sort of the mad Albert Einstein hair, creating these inventions that are often, you know, go wrong or are used for bad purposes. The next film trope is this idea of disguise. Do we know what a disguise is? Disguise? No? This is where you wear clothes or a costume to hide yourself so people don't know who you are. So, for example, if I put on a beard, glasses, a hat...
Means to cover your genuine identification.
Exactly, so as to cover your identity so people don't know who you are.
Spider-Man?
Like Spider-Man, for example, wears it. And you know, this is a fairly typical thing. And in the Wallace and Gromit movies, they kind of make fun of this idea of disguise. There's a character in Wallace and Gromit who's actually a penguin, but he just puts like a little rubber glove on his head. And people think he's a chicken, and so he's a criminal, and so he puts on this thing and he commits crimes, and everyone thinks it's a chicken who's committing the crimes and not the penguin. I think this is sort of making fun a little bit of movies where characters, particularly superhero characters, will only wear one thing to disguise themselves, and no one recognises who it is. So as a good example is something like Superman, who has, you know, simply a pair of glasses to separate him from his superhero and his normal life. But no one ever recognises that they're the same people, so I think it's making fun of that. The other one that I wanted to talk about is this idea of unlimited bullets. If anyone has ever watched any action movies, these kind of Bad Boys, these kinds of films, or mafia movies, when you see people firing guns, it seems like their bullets never run out. You know, they never have to put new bullets into the gun, they can just keep firing and it never stops. And I think this is also made fun a little bit of in Wallace and Gromit. There's a scene where the character, this dog, is on a train, and it's a model children's toy train. To keep going, he has to keep putting the track down on the floor, and he has this little box, and he's putting thousands of these tracks down on the floor, and they never run out, and they never stop. And again, I think this is trying to copy or make fun of this idea in films where they fire guns and the bullets never run out as well. There are many others in Wallace and Gromit. Not enough time now to go through all of them. But here are some of the other ones that you might sort of see. I won't explain these now, but these are ones that you could look up and find out information about later. Okay. So yes, Wallace and Gromit is a cartoon, and it tries to copy and make fun of some of the very popular and common film tropes and cliches and common elements of other normal movies. And for that reason, it can be quite an amusing and interesting film for you to watch. It's good for children, but also adults quite enjoy it because there are many connections to films you've already seen as well. That's the end of my presentation for today. It is my reference. I only have one. It wasn't a very well referenced and researched presentation. So, any questions? No? Thank God. Okay. You can stop now.